There comes a point when history turns into memory, and memory turns into myth. John's life, once fragile and ordinary, had long since crossed that threshold. What remained of him in the world was no longer the man himself but the story of the man, the tale of one who was broken, who chose forgiveness, and who rose again. Generations spoke of him without truly knowing his face. To some, he was the teacher who lost everything and found peace. To others, he was a father whose words became a gift to his children. To still others, he was a philosopher, a writer, a wanderer. The truth was simpler and more complex at once. John was just a man who lived, who suffered, and who chose love when anger would have been easier. But stories have a way of growing. His journals, once tucked inside a wooden box, had long been preserved in archives, studied by scholars, quoted by leaders, and reimagined by artists. His reflections had become scripture for the broken-hearted, poetry for the weary, wisdom for those standing at the edge of despair. In villages, children still repeated his words without knowing where they came from. In cities, his phrases were carved into monuments and whispered in dark alleys. On the internet, centuries after his death, his lines were still posted and shared, sometimes without his name, but always with his spirit. He had become part of the language of healing. What made John endure was not perfection, but humanity. He was not a saint untouched by suffering. He was not a conqueror who bent the world to his will. He was simply a man who had been betrayed, who had sat in silence with his pain, who had chosen, one step at a time, to rise again. And in that ordinariness, people found themselves. The philosophers said his life proved that resilience was not an achievement but a process. The poets said his words revealed the beauty of brokenness. The common people, however, said it more simply: he reminds us we are not alone. And perhaps that was his greatest gift. Time wore on. His name was sometimes misremembered, sometimes misattributed. But the essence of his story never vanished. The idea of the quiet life, a life rebuilt not through rage or revenge, but through forgiveness and love, became a cultural seed, planted deep in the soil of humanity. One day, centuries after his passing, a teacher stood before her students and told them a story. She did not use his name. She simply said, "There was once a man who lost everything. And instead of turning bitter, he chose to forgive. Instead of giving up, he chose to rise. He was no king, no hero, no saint, just a man like you and me. And that is why his story matters. Because if he could rise, so can we." And in that moment, though his name had faded, John lived again. For immortality is not in stone statues or golden crowns. It is in the way a story lingers, the way it shapes the choices of people who never knew the teller. It is in every act of courage sparked by his words, in every broken heart that found strength in his silence, in every horizon where someone sat and whispered, "I will rise again." John was gone. Yet he was everywhere. Not as a ghost, but as a truth carried forward. The man became a story. And the story became eternal.